Welcome to the Battle Ready Sermon Podcast with Captain Rob Westwood-Payne.
I'm having a real problem this morning. Don't know what it is about this particular chair. It's not done that before. I'll rip my ear off as well soon. But I wonder what your experience has been like with silence and solitude. Have a think for a moment. What's your experience been with silence and solitude? Some of you may love it and you spend hours and hours in silence and solitude. Some of you might find it really difficult and have that kind of problem. I started to use silence and solitude as a spiritual discipline probably nearly 10 years ago now. You won't be surprised, for those of you who know me well, that there is an app called Headspace, which has guided meditations in it. It's not a Christian app, but I've used the guided meditations in Headspace as a way of connecting with God and just kind of thought through the guidance that you get through the app and to think about it in a Christian way and a way of connecting with God. Have to say that even after nearly 10 years, I don't really feel I'm very good at it, really good at meditating. I can quite often drift off into thought so deep that it's kind of 2/3 of the way through the 10-minute guided meditation and I suddenly think, oh, hang on a minute, I'm supposed to be meditating and letting my thoughts go, not deep in thoughts and thinking. By way of an example, when I wrote this sermon, which was a week ago last Tuesday, I knew I had a leadership team meeting in the evening and I knew I needed to announce to them about the additional appointment I was about to get. And I spent the 10 minutes meditating that morning, thinking about what I was going to say to them about that additional appointment. And then suddenly the meditation was over. And so that's kind of my experience with silence and solitude on many occasions. But what about your experience of silence and solitude? Some of you are probably sitting there going, silence and solitude, if only I had time. I'm too busy for silence and solitude. You know, when I'm at work, I worry that my coffee break was too long, let alone sitting and doing meditation. I quite often skip lunch. I worry if I should have started work earlier or finished it later. I wondered whether I should have caught up with my emails in the evening or over the weekend. I'm surrounded by KPIs or standards or deadlines that I have to meet. I'm constantly pinged by notifications from my laptop, my mobile and my tablet and anything else that might ping at me. I'm far too busy for silence and solitude. Some of you may well be thinking, actually, you know what, I have too much silence and solitude in my life. I live on my own, the house is quiet, or wherever I live is quiet. I have far too much, I'm on my own, I have far too much silence and solitude. I'm going to think about how we integrate silence and solitude as a spiritual discipline into our lives this morning. And this is part of a new four-part series called Soulful Service, Nurturing Spiritual Vitality and Ministry. It's based on Ruth Haley Barton's book, Strengthening the Soul of Your Leadership. If you're a leader and you haven't read that book, I absolutely encourage you to read it. It's really good. But we are thinking about it not as leaders, but as disciples of Jesus. And if we follow Jesus, then we're a disciple of Jesus. And if we are a disciple of Jesus, then whether we understand it or not, we are involved in ministry and service. You may think to yourself, well, I don't have a formal role in service and ministry. I don't have a title here, but you still serve. You still have ministry amongst us, whether it's that welcoming smile as people come into the building, or whether it's the gift of chatting, which some of us have, whether it's praying for people and interceding for them, whether it's just caring for people, showing that we care. All sorts of different service and ministry that we have in this place, whether it carries a title with it or not. And you also have a service and a ministry out on your front line, wherever your front line is the rest of the week. At school, at college, in our workplaces, in our families, amongst our friends and our neighbours. We have a service and a ministry. Every disciple of Jesus has a service and a ministry. Again, it's probably not a formal role, but there'll be the service of influence, of just influencing people with the gospel of Jesus. The ministry of example, showing people what it means to live out the ethical values of our Christian faith. The witness and testimony to how God makes a difference in our lives and how we are part of his story and how the people that we work with and live with day by day are part of that story too. But sometimes we have to realize and recognize that we get into a space where that ministry and service, whatever it is, can feel like something that we kind of put on, like a uniform jacket or any other kind of clothing. A service and a ministry that we put on rather than something that flows from a deep inner well, fed from the pure source of the Holy Spirit. I wonder if you ever recognize that you go into situations and you kind of put on your Christian face. You know, maybe it's when you walk in here on a Sunday, or maybe it's when you go into work. I'm going to put my Christian face on. It's time to be a Christian now. Or you gather yourself up and you say to yourself, now I've got to go and be the adult in the room and put on my patience or put on my kindness or put on my self-control or whatever it is that we think we need for that particular situation. Perhaps as you examine your heart before God this morning and where your service and your ministry comes in, you realize that there's a gap between the values and the behaviors that you know you should display as a disciple of Jesus and the ones that you're really living out. Maybe as you examine yourself before God this morning, you realize that you come and you raise your hands or clap them in worship as a way of manufacturing the emotion that you know you should feel in worship, but you realize it's been too long since you actually experienced real intimacy with God in worship. Maybe you find yourself in a situation where someone needs your pastoral care towards them and you swallow and you realize you don't actually care, but you feel that you have to show that you do. Perhaps all you can think about are the endless meetings that you have to attend, the mind-numbing routines that you go through, and the chronically difficult people that you have to face every day. Perhaps you're tired of being a perfectionist, or like me, tired of being a reforming perfectionist. Or you resent those who don't seem to work as hard as you do. Or perhaps your appetite for approval from others is never quite sated. Now, I am sure that all of us in this room today and those who are joining us online who are disciples of Jesus really and truly and honestly and with integrity desire to be as close to God as possible. But we also have to admit that sometimes in the midst of all the busyness, it doesn't always come off that way. We're drawn by God's calling on our lives to care for those who hurt, but we end up with compassion fatigue. We know that God calls us to the life of servanthood, but we feel that we've just ended up being a service provider and it's more of a transaction than it is about a caring action. We're simply providing for people's needs and doing it not for the glory of God, as the general reminded us earlier. Well, this series, Soulful Service, aims to explore some practical insights and some biblical wisdom for cultivating that spiritual vitality in service and ministry, and to discover how we can apply these principles to enrich our service and our personal lives. And today we're just going to spend a few minutes exploring how, if we want our ministry and our service to be soulful, to come from that kind of deep inner well, to be fed by the streams of living water, to be powered by the wind of the Holy Spirit, then we need to find times in our lives and in our days for moments of quiet reflection and communion with God. In the verses that we heard earlier from Mark chapter 1, Jesus models the importance of silence and solitude to soulful service. Our passage began with verse 35. Before daybreak the next morning, Jesus got up and went out to an isolated place to pray. We are not even at the end of the first chapter of Mark. And I love Mark's gospel because Mark is very short, he's very succinct, he kind of hits you between the eyes with everything that you need to know about the gospel of Jesus, about the story of Jesus. And we're not even at the end of the first chapter. And Mark has already made the point about the importance of prayer, of silence and solitude to Jesus' ministry. So important was it, in fact, says Mark, that Jesus was prepared to get up before anyone else, before daybreak, and isolate himself from everyone around him in order to pray and to enjoy silence and solitude with his Father. That's how important it was to Jesus. And it's not an isolated incident, it's a pattern that we see throughout Jesus' ministry. So Jesus prayed when he was baptized. He prayed when he dealt with the crowds. He prayed when he was transfigured before his disciples. He prayed before he chose his 12 disciples. He prayed when people wanted to make him a king. He prayed for individuals and he prayed for himself before he was led away to face death. It's clear as you read through the gospel accounts that Jesus understood that prayer was a vital link between him and his Father. And it was a vital link that fed his service and his ministry. Had he attempted his ministry and service with little or no prayer, as someone who was truly and properly human, as our doctrine says, like us, he would have struggled to find the grace and the strength and the peace that he needed to fulfill God's purpose and calling on his life. He needed the mind of God the Father to serve the people around him, just as we do as we serve the people around us. And while spontaneous arrow prayers, and you know what I mean by arrow prayers? Arrow prayers are those ones we throw up when we need to. It's like, just God help me in this situation. Help me in this conversation. That's an arrow prayer. And they're good and they're helpful in some circumstances. Jesus knew that he needed to set time aside for prolonged and deeper communication with prayer, with God. That there were times in his ministry when he needed to break away from all the others around him and talk to God. And he was prepared to get up very early in the morning in order to do it. And why did Jesus in his ministry and service need silence and solitude so much? Well, again, as I say, we're only in the first chapter of Mark, but Jesus is already busy in ministry and service, and his popularity is growing. It was the Sabbath, and he taught in the synagogue. Whilst he's there in the synagogue teaching, he casts out an evil spirit. Then he goes back to Simon Peter's for a spot of Sunday lunch, chicken and roast potatoes and Yorkshire puddings, no doubt. And his mother-in-law, Simon Peter's mother-in-law, has a high fever. And so Jesus heals her. And even after sunset on that day, so even after it's gone dark, many sick and demon-possessed people were brought to him to be exorcised and healed. And the whole town gathered to watch him work. Imagine the pressure that must have put on Jesus after an already busy day. He must have been exhausted. And he knew that he needed to pray and to gather his strength. But just as important, maybe even more importantly than that, he also knew that he needed God's guidance. He needed that God-given sense of direction as to what to do next. Because the very next two verses say, when the disciples found him in this isolated place praying to his Father, they said, everyone is looking for you. All those people who were crowded around the door the night before, they're looking for you again. There's more work for you to do. And Jesus replies, we must go on to other towns as well, and I will preach to them too. That is why I came. And I am fairly certain that if it had not been for Jesus' time of prayer before daybreak that day, that silence and solitude that he had enjoyed in that isolated place, then the temptation may well have been to capitalize on his growing popularity in Capernaum and to go back to the crowds that he had been with the day before. But in that silence and solitude, he had received guidance from his Father, and so he knew that it was time to move on. and to serve and minister elsewhere. And here's an important point that I want us to note this morning. See, it's very easy to domesticate these verses. It's very easy to say, well, the point of the sermon this morning is that Jesus went away from others to pray, to enjoy his quiet time, and to practice silence and solitude, and so we should all do the same. But what we need to recognize is that what Jesus is engaging in here is anything but a quiet time. It is anything but a quiet time. If you look at verse 35 again from the New International Version, it says this: very early in the morning, while it was still dark, Jesus got up, left the house, and went off to a solitary place where he prayed. Jesus is praying, says Mark, in silence and solitude while it was still dark. Do you recognize that phrase? Anybody? Do you recognize that phrase? Mark uses it again when Jesus is handed over to Pilate while it was still dark. And he also uses it to describe the time when the women came to the tomb where Jesus was buried, when they thought he was dead and gone. They came while it was still dark. Mark goes on to describe where Jesus is praying as a solitary place, or isolated, or deserted. Do we recognize that? Again, just a few verses before in Mark chapter 1, that's exactly the same place where Jesus was tempted by the devil. So these are not precious moments with God. Do not for one moment imagine Jesus sitting in a nice comfortable chair with his feet up and his Bible on his lap and a candle and some worship music playing in the background. How we might enjoy our quiet time perhaps sometimes, comfortably enjoying the silence and the solitude. This is Jesus engaged in nothing less than spiritual warfare. He is out there while it was still dark. The world was still dark. This is Jesus engaged in silence and solitude and spiritual warfare in a solitary place where he'd been tempted by the devil, where he was on his own. And he may well have been tempted in those hours that he spent in silence and solitude to choose between healing and preaching, or to continue to do both. He may have been tempted to stay in Capernaum where he was rather than move on. Whatever the conversation, whatever the battle, whatever the spiritual warfare that went on in that place, Jesus' time of solitude and silence was essential for him to battle the dark spiritual forces that would stop his ministry and service in its tracks, and instead to ensure that his ministry and service were following God's purposes. Now, many of us are Salvationists. And we have to recognize that the Salvation Army is an activist movement. We say, do we not, where there's a need, there's the Salvation Army. If we see a need, we want to meet it. If we see somebody who needs help, then we want to give that help. It's instinctive it's in us. It's part of our DNA. If we see something that needs doing, we'll just get on and do it. And that's good. Do not hear from me this morning that I'm criticizing that. James chapter 2 verse 17 says, so you see, faith by itself isn't enough. Unless it produces good deeds, it is dead and useless. We don't want a dead and useless faith, do we? You don't sound very certain about that. But it is essential as activists that we remember and we hold on to the fact that we don't simply rush into action without prayer, without silence, without solitude. Jesus' example is of prayer and engaging in that spiritual warfare before he goes into action. And if we're not careful, the demands of family and work life, even of our church life, can be so much that they interrupt or block our opportunities for prayer, for silence, and for solitude. And when that happens, we end up springing into action before we prepare our hearts and our minds before God. And if Jesus prayed in order to live a godly life full of power and to have that spiritual warfare battle and to ensure that his ministry and his service was soulful, then so must we. Jesus is God incarnate. He is God in human form. He is the creator of all. He spoke the world into existence. He holds everything together by his power, but he still lived by and in prayer. He still needed silence and solitude. Prayer is the great necessity of our lives if our service and ministry is going to be soulful. So we need to pray. We need to find times to get away alone. It might, and you know that I try not to shy away from difficult messages, so here's one. It might mean getting up a little earlier. It might mean getting up a little earlier. I've learned in my life that if I want to get something done, whether that's silence and solitude, whether it's exercise when I'm into it, even drinking water, then I have to do it first thing in the morning. Because if I leave it till later in the day, there's too much going on, or I'm too tired at the end of the day and it gets missed. If I think something is important and I need to get it done that day, I have to do it first thing. Now, we need not spend hours and hours in prayer, but each one of us who are disciples of Jesus have to spend some time in silence and solitude. And if your home is too busy and noisy, maybe it's about driving to your local supermarket and parking at the back of the car park and having some silence and solitude there, or any other car park for that matter. Hiding behind the wheel and praying. Maybe it's about having a walk around your neighbourhood if your neighbourhood is quiet enough, and praying while you do that. Maybe it's about getting to the office or to your place of work before everyone else and taking some time to pray then. Maybe it's praying on your commute, whether you're in the car or on the train or walking. Again, I will just issue the public service announcement that if you're praying in the car and you're driving, please keep your eyes open. Maybe it's about going into the bathroom, locking the door so that no one else can get in, lighting some candles and getting in the bath. I don't know. All sorts of different ways in which we can carve out time for silence and solitude. And whatever it is that you need to do to get that time, my challenge and my encouragement to you this morning is just do it. Whatever it takes. Finding time to pray, to practice silence and solitude is not easy in this modern and busy world, but it is vital. And we can support each other. We have a job to do as we meet here on a Sunday morning, because we can keep each other accountable and support each other to prioritise prayer, silence and solitude. I think I said last week that when we go out from here and we enjoy tea and coffee together, we can talk about all sorts of things. But actually, maybe the most kingdom-building conversation that we can have this morning is, how do you get on with silence and solitude? What do you do to carve out some time? When do you do your quiet time, your personal devotions, whatever you want to call it? What is it that gets in the way? What crowds you out? And then we find out we're more like each other than we think sometimes. And we may just have an idea that, oh yeah, I could do that. I like that idea. I could do that. How much different would our discipleship be if we actually talk to each other about these things? In our growth groups, that's a place where we can ask each other, what resources do you have that practice silence and solitude? Somebody quoted a devotional on Facebook a couple of weeks ago, and I liked it so much I went and found the devotional, and I'm now using that devotional in the morning and finding it really useful. We all have different resources and we can all share with each other about those. What strategies do we have to ensure that our time of prayer with God isn't interrupted? I think it was Susanna Wesley, and I can't remember how many children she had. It was in the teens, I think, who used to sit down after lunch with all these children running around and put her apron over her head. And that was the cue to the children that she was not to be disturbed. So unless you all have 20 children each, there are no excuses. Maybe it's just about putting your apron over your head. I don't know. But imagine for a moment if all of us pledged to prioritize silence and solitude like Jesus did. Imagine how much better equipped we would be to discern God's direction for our lives and for our call. Imagine how we would be better able to serve others, not just here on a Sunday, but on our front lines during the week, at school, at college, in our families, at our workplaces, with wisdom and clarity because we've spent that time with Jesus. Those places would be so much healthier and vibrant as a result. So may we each experience the transformative power of silence and solitude. And as we embrace moments of quiet reflection, may our ministry and our service here in this building and out on our front lines be strengthened as we deepen our connection with God. Having preached on it, we have to practice it. We're going to have a minute or two of silent prayer, and then I'm going to invite you to join with me in the prayer that I read out. Let's pray together. Holy One, there is something I wanted to tell you, but there have been errands to run, bills to pay, arrangements to make, meetings to attend, friends to entertain, washing to do. And I forget what it is I wanted to say to you. And mostly I forget what I'm about or why. Oh God, don't forget me, please, for the sake of Jesus Christ. Eternal One, there is something I wanted to tell you, but my mind races with worrying and watching, with weighing and planning, with rutted slights and pothole grievances, with leaky dreams and leaky plumbing and leaky relationships I keep trying to plug up. And my attention is preoccupied with loneliness, with doubt, and with things I covet. And I forget what it is that I wanted to say to you, and how to say it honestly, or how to do much of anything. Oh God, don't forget me, please, for the sake of Jesus Christ. Almighty One, there is something I wanted to ask you, but I stumble along the edge of a nameless rage, haunted by 100 floating fears of terrorists of all kinds, of losing my job, of failing, of getting sick and old, of having loved ones die, of dying, of having no one love me, not even myself. and of not being sure who I am or that I'm worth very much. And I forget what the real question is that I wanted to ask. And I forget to listen anyway because you seem unreal and far away. And I forget what it is I have forgotten. Oh God, don't forget me, please, for the sake of Jesus Christ. Oh Father and Mother in heaven, perhaps you've already heard what I wanted to tell you. What I wanted to ask is, forgive me, heal me, increase my courage, please. Renew in me a little of love and faith and a sense of confidence and a vision of what it might mean to live as though you were real and I mattered and everyone was sister and brother. What I wanted to ask in my blundering way is, don't give up on me. Don't become too sad about me, but laugh with me and try again with me, and I will with you too. What I wanted to ask is for peace enough to want and work for more, for joy enough to share, and for awareness that is keen enough to sense your presence here, now, there, then, always. Amen. As the band comes back to the platform, I invite you to turn to Song 756, if you're using a songbook. This song is simply a reminder to walk daily and moment by moment with God in prayer. He walks with God who speaks to God in prayer and daily brings to him his daily care. What are the promises in this song? That if we do that, we will possess inward peace. Our hearts will be refreshed. We will be able to rest in the presence of God. That we will be able to live out that example of being like Jesus Christ that we so want to live out. That we will live upright lives that accord with the values that we want to live by. And that we will be crowned by God when our labours cease. Let's stand and sing these 3 verses. every moment of this coming week, but particularly in your moments of silence and solitude. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. Amen. God bless you.
If you would like to subscribe to Battle Ready Sermons wherever you choose to listen to podcasts, or if you'd like to receive them direct to your inbox, head to www.equippinghispeople.com/sermons and follow the instructions.